The story of rule-based thinking begins long before the word deontology was ever spoken. In the ancient world, people already felt that some actions were right because they fit a pattern, not because they produced a good result. This feeling can be seen in the way early societies wrote down rules for trade, for family, and for worship. The earliest known collection of laws is the Code of Hammurabi, carved on stone more than 4,000 years ago. One line from that code reads, "If a man puts out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out." The rule is clear. The punishment matches the crime. The code does not ask whether the punishment will make the city safer, it simply says the rule must be followed. A different kind of early rule comes from religion. The 10 Commandments, for example, tell people not to steal, not to kill, and to keep the Sabbath holy. The focus is on obeying the command, not on calculating the best outcome of each act. In many ancient myths, the heroes are praised for keeping a promise to a god, even when breaking the promise might bring a quick victory. The idea that duty can outweigh desire is already present. Greek philosophy adds another layer. Aristotle wrote about virtue as a habit of doing the right thing. He said, "We become just by doing just acts." The emphasis is on the repeated act, not on the result of a single act. Aristotle's view is still about character, but it points toward the idea that there are right ways to act that are not decided by the end they produce. From these early sources, a shift can be traced. In the early stories and laws, the focus is on the act itself. Later, some thinkers began to ask whether the best thing to do is the one that brings the most happiness or the most profit. That question creates a tension between outcome-based thinking and duty-based thinking. The roots of deontology lie in the side that says duty matters first. One simple example shows the point. Imagine a friend asks for a ride to the airport. The promise was made the night before. The road is slick, and a shortcut could get the friend there faster, but it also risks an accident. A rule-based view says keep the promise and drive safely, even if it means arriving late. The focus is on the promise, not on the speed of arrival. A second example is the traffic light. The light turns red, and the driver stops. The rule is clear. Stop at red. The driver could argue that the light is broken and that crossing would save time, but the rule says stop. The driver obeys the rule, even if the result is a few extra minutes in traffic. The rule protects everyone, not just the driver. These everyday scenes illustrate how rule-based thinking works. They also show why people feel comfort in having clear guidelines. The rules give a sense of order and fairness. They say that some actions are right because they fit a pattern that has been agreed upon. But not everyone agrees that rules should be the first guide. One common counterargument says that the results of an action are what truly matter. A farmer might argue that feeding the family is more important than following a law that says one must not sell grain during a famine. The farmer says the good outcome, survival, justifies breaking the rule. This view is called consequentialism, a name for the idea that the ends decide the means. A second counterargument points out that rules can be too rigid. Imagine a doctor who follows a rule that says never lie to a patient. If a patient is dying and a lie could give them peace, the rule may cause more harm. Critics say that strict rules ignore the complexity of real life. They argue that sometimes a rule must bend to fit the situation. Both criticisms have been raised many times in history. In medieval Europe, guilds set strict rules for who could practice a trade, how long an apprentice must train, and what prices could be charged. A young craftsman who broke the rule and sold a piece early could be fined or expelled. Some argued that the guild rules kept quality high, while others said they stifled innovation and kept prices high. The tension between the safety of a rule and the need for flexibility shows up again and again. The Code of Hammurabi also faced criticism in its own time. Some judges argued that the "eye for an eye" rule could be too harsh for a poor family that could not afford a similar punishment. They suggested that a judge should look at the circumstances and perhaps lower the fine. The code itself allowed a judge to adjust the penalty if the victim agreed, showing an early awareness of the need for flexibility. These stories help to see why the idea of duty grew. The ancient thinkers and lawmakers wanted a way to guide people that did not rely on guessing the future. They wanted a stable compass. That compass later became the focus of a philosopher named Immanuel Kant, who will be explored in a later section. Kant will take the idea of duty and turn it into a universal principle, saying that a rule must be one that everyone could follow without contradiction. Before reaching Kant, however, it is useful to see how the early ideas link to modern life. Today, many people follow rules at work, in schools, and online. A student who promises to turn in a paper on time follows a rule of honesty. A driver who obeys a stop sign follows a rule of safety. In each case, the rule is not chosen because it promises the best grade or the fastest trip, but because it is seen as the right thing to do. Modern interpretations often blend rule-based thinking with outcome concerns. Some legal systems have strict liability rules that do not ask about intent, while other laws allow judges to consider the consequences. This mix shows that the old debate still lives on. The idea that duty can guide action remains strong, but it is often softened by a look at results. An analogy can help to picture the balance. Think of a river dam. The dam is a rule that holds back water, protecting the town downstream. The water pressure is the desire for a quick result, like saving time or money. If the dam is too rigid, it may burst under pressure, causing a flood. If the dam is too flexible, the water may spill over and flood the town anyway. The best design lets the dam hold most of the water but also has a spillway to release excess safely. In moral thinking, the dam is the rule, the spillway is the allowance for exceptions, and the water is the outcome. Another analogy uses a game of chess. The rules of chess tell each player how pieces move. A player who follows the rules can still win or lose depending on skill. If a player tried to change the rules mid-game to capture the opponent's king faster, the game would lose its meaning. The rules give the game structure, while the outcome, winning or losing, is still important. Moral rule-based thinking works similarly. The rules give structure, while the results still matter. Historical anecdotes also illustrate how rules shaped societies. In ancient Babylon, a merchant who broke the law about weighing goods could be fined heavily. The law was meant to protect buyers from cheating. The merchant might argue that a small mistake did not hurt anyone, but the rule was applied anyway to keep trust in the market. This story shows how a rule can protect a larger system, even when a single case seems harmless. In medieval Europe, the Guild of Blacksmiths required every apprentice to serve a 7-year term before becoming a master. One apprentice tried to leave early to start his own shop. The guild leaders cited the rule and forced him to stay. The apprentice argued that his skill was ready, but the guild said the rule ensured quality and safety for the community. The story reflects the tension between personal ambition and the community's need for standards. Both anecdotes show how rules can be both protective and restrictive. They also show that people have always wrestled with the question of when a rule should bend. When the story moves forward to the Enlightenment, the shift becomes clearer. Thinkers began to ask whether a rule could be justified without reference to its outcomes. They asked whether a rule could be known by reason alone. This line of thought leads directly to Kant's famous categorical imperative, a principle that says one should act only according to a rule that could be made into a universal law. The phrase, "act only according to that maxim which you can at the same time, will that it become a universal law," will appear in the next section. That phrase is a direct echo of the ancient desire for a rule that works for everyone. not just for a single case. The early ideas also influence modern professional codes. Doctors follow the Hippocratic Oath, which says, "Do no harm." The oath is a rule that guides action regardless of the possible benefits of a risky treatment. Lawyers follow codes of ethics that forbid lying to a court, even if a lie might win a case. These modern rules trace their roots back to the ancient belief that some duties are absolute. In everyday life, the rule of keeping promises can be seen in simple friendships. If a friend promises to meet at a coffee shop at 3, the rule says to be there on time. If a traffic light turns red, the rule says to stop. These two examples show how rule-based thinking is woven into daily habits. They also show that the rule does not ask for a calculation of the best result, only for the act itself. Critics still argue that sometimes the rule can cause more harm than good. A driver who stops at a red light while an ambulance rushes behind may delay a life-saving response. The driver must weigh the rule against the urgent need. This is a modern version of the "full rules are too rigid" objection. Another modern critique comes from climate policy. Some say that strict rules about emissions can hurt economies, and that flexible, result-focused policies might achieve better overall outcomes. These debates keep the conversation alive. The story of rule-based thinking also appears in literature. In the ancient epic of Gilgamesh, the hero faces a decision about whether to break a promise to a friend for personal gain. The narrative shows that breaking the promise leads to sorrow, reinforcing the idea that duty matters. In the medieval tale of the Knight's Code, a knight must choose between following the code of chivalry and saving a village from a fire. The code tells him to protect the weak, even if it means risking his own life. The tale illustrates the power of duty. Quotes from primary sources give the voice of the past. Hammurabi's code states, "If a man puts out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out." Aristotle writes, "We become just by doing just acts." The 10 Commandments command, "Thou shalt not steal." These words show that the idea of rule-based conduct has been spoken for millennia. The shift from outcome-focused to duty also appears in early religious debates. In the story of Abraham and Isaac, Abraham is asked to sacrifice his son. The test is about obedience to a divine command, not about the result of losing a child. The narrative has been used to argue that duty to a higher command can outweigh personal loss. The early religious codes also include the concept of sacrifice for the community. In ancient Israel, the law required that a guilty person bring a sacrifice to atone for sin. The act of sacrifice was a rule, not a calculation of how many lives would be saved. The emphasis was on following the prescribed way to restore balance. When the story moves toward the modern era, the idea of duty becomes more abstract. The Enlightenment thinkers ask whether duty can be based on pure reason. They argue that reason can tell us what the right rule is, without looking at the result. This rational approach is what Kant will later formalize. The next part of the video will show how Kant turns these ancient ideas into a systematic moral law. In the meantime, the everyday examples already show how rule-based thinking lives on. A student who promises to study for a test follows a rule of responsibility. A parent who promises to pick up a child from school follows a rule of care. The rule guides the action. Kant's categorical imperative can feel like a heavy idea, but it works like a simple game rule that everybody must follow. The rule is not a suggestion. It is a rule that, if anyone broke it, the game would fall apart. In the same way, Kant asks people to ask whether the rule behind an action could be made into a rule for everyone. If the answer is yes, the action is allowed. If the answer is no, the action is not allowed. This is the formula of universal law. A second rule that Kant calls the formula of humanity says that people must always treat other people as ends in themselves, never only as tools to get something else. In other words, Each person must be respected for who they are, not just for what they can do. The story of this idea begins in the late 1700s, when the world was changing fast. The Enlightenment was spreading ideas about reason and rights. In that climate, a German professor named Immanuel Kant began to write about how moral rules could be based on reason alone. He wanted a moral law that did not depend on personal feelings or on the results of an action. He wrote in his famous work, The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, that walk only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This short sentence is the heart of the first formula. Later he added, treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always as an end and never merely as a means. That sentence is the core of the second formula. Imagine a game of soccer. The rule that every player must stay on the field during play is a rule that can be applied to everyone. If one player decided to sit out whenever they felt tired, the game would become chaotic. The rule works because it can be imagined as a rule for all players. Kant's first formula works the same way. Before acting, a person asks, if everyone did what I am about to do, would the world still work? If the answer is no, the action is not moral. Consider a simple everyday scene. A person named Alex sees a friend in need of a ride to the doctor. Alex could drive the friend, even though it means arriving late to a meeting. If Alex asks whether it would be okay for everyone to help a friend in a similar situation, the answer is clearly yes. The rule, help a friend who needs a ride when you can do so without great harm to yourself, can be turned into a universal rule. The action passes the test of universal law. At the same time, Alex treats the friend as an end, respecting the friend's health and dignity, not just as a chance to feel good about being helpful. Now imagine another scene. Sam finds a wallet on the sidewalk. Inside is a driver's license and a few $100s. Sam could keep the money, or Sam could look for the owner and return the wallet. The rule behind keeping the money would be, it is okay to take something that belongs to someone else if you find it. If everyone acted that way, loss of trust would spread, and the rule would break down. The universal law test says the rule fails. The opposite rule, if you find something that belongs to another, you should try to return it, can be made universal. Sam's action respects the owner as a person with rights, not just as a source of money. The rule fits both formulas of the categorical imperative. Kant's idea did not appear in a vacuum. He was taught by earlier thinkers like Rousseau, who argued that moral law comes from human nature, and by the rationalist tradition of Leibniz and Wolff. Kant took their ideas and added his own twist. The moral law must be discovered by pure reason, not by feelings or by the outcomes of actions. He wrote that the moral law is like a compass that points the same way for everyone, no matter where they stand. Not everyone agrees that a rule must be the same for all people in every situation. One common criticism says that strict universality ignores the details of each case. For example, a doctor might need to break a promise to a patient in order to save a life. If the doctor follows a universal rule that promises must never be broken, the doctor could cause more harm. Critics argue that context matters, and that a rule that works in one setting may not work in another. They say that moral thinking should be flexible enough to look at the specific facts before deciding. A second criticism says that emotions should guide actions, not cold reason. People often feel compassion, love, or guilt, and those feelings push them toward right actions. Critics claim that Kant's system removes the warmth of moral life. They point out that a person who follows a rule without feeling may act in a way that looks correct but feels empty. They argue that moral judgment should include the heart as well as the head. Kant answered the first criticism by saying that the universal law test does not ignore facts. The test asks whether the rule can be universalized without contradiction. If a rule would cause a contradiction when applied everywhere, it fails. In the doctor example, the rule "never break a promise" would lead to a contradiction when the promise is to keep a secret that could cause death. The doctor would have to choose a rule that can be universal without breaking the purpose of the promise. Kant believed that reason can see these contradictions, and that the right rule will survive the test. In response to the second criticism, Kant said that emotions are not reliable guides because they can change from person to person and from moment to moment. Reason, on the other hand, is the same for every rational being. He wrote, "Two things fill the mind with ever-increasing awe: the starry heavens above and the moral law within. The moral law is a part of each person's mind, like a light that never goes out. When people follow that light, they act out of respect for the law itself, not because they feel a particular way at that moment." Historical anecdotes help to see how these ideas lived in Kant's world. In the winter of 1785, Kant gave a lecture at the University of Königsberg that lasted only a few minutes, but it sparked a lively debate among his students. One student asked whether the universal law test could apply to lying to a tyrant. Kant replied that if lying were universal, trust would disappear, and the very purpose of lying would be lost. The student left the hall convinced that the rule against lying held even in extreme cases. This story shows how Kant used simple questions to illustrate his complex ideas. Another anecdote comes from the French Revolution. After the fall of the monarchy, the new government tried to rewrite the law based on reason. In 1791, the French National Assembly passed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document that echoed Kant's emphasis on universal rights and the dignity of each person. The Assembly quoted, "All men are born free and equal in rights." While the French leaders did not cite Kant directly, the spirit of his universal law can be heard in their call for laws that apply to everyone, not just to a privileged few. This historical link shows how Kant's ideas reached beyond Germany and helped shape modern legal thought. Real-world applications of the categorical imperative appear in many places today. In business, a company that decides not to exploit cheap labor abroad follows the rule "never treat workers merely as a means to profit." The rule can be made universal, and it respects the humanity of each worker. In medicine, doctors who follow informed consent procedures treat patients as ends, giving them the information they need to decide for themselves. In law, the principle that no one is above the law reflects the idea that the same rule must apply to every citizen. Modern philosophers have taken Kant's formulas and given them new twists. Some argue that the universal law test can be understood as a test of consistency. An action is right if it can be imagined as a law that everyone could follow without causing a logical clash. Others have tried to combine Kant's respect for persons with the idea of care, saying that caring relationships also create universal duties. The basic structure, however, stays the same. Ask whether the rule behind an action could be a rule for everyone, and ask whether the action treats each person as a valuable end. A useful analogy for the formula of humanity is a garden. Each plant in a garden is different, but the gardener must care for each one, not just use them to make the garden look nice. If the gardener only saw the plants as tools for a pretty view, some plants would be neglected or harmed. Treating each plant as an end means giving it water, sunlight, and space, because each plant has its own worth. In the same way, people must treat each other with respect, not just as tools for personal gain. Another analogy is a classroom rule about sharing. The rule says, when a classmate asks for a pencil, you must lend it if you can. The rule can be applied to everyone, and it respects each student's need to learn. If a student kept the pencil for themselves, the rule would break down and learning would suffer. This simple rule shows how the universal law works. The rule is clear, it can be applied to all, and it respects each person's right to participate. Linking back to the root section of the video, the idea of universal law grows out of the Enlightenment's belief that reason can guide human life. Earlier thinkers argued that natural law was written in the world, but Kant moved the law into the mind of each rational being. This shift from external nature to internal reason set the stage for later debates about whether duties or outcomes matter more. The next part of the video will move from Kant's duty-based view to the contrast with consequentialist theories, which judge actions by the results they produce. That debate asks whether the moral worth of an action lies in the rule behind it or in the happiness it creates. To sum up, Kant's categorical imperative is a two-part test. The first part asks whether the rule behind an action can be a rule for everyone. The second part asks whether the action treats each person as a valuable end, not just as a means. The test works like a game rule that must hold for all players. Everyday examples, such as giving a friend a ride or returning a lost wallet, show how the test can guide simple choices. Historical anecdotes from Kant's lectures and the French Revolution illustrate how the ideas spread. Counterarguments remind that context and emotion also matter, but Kant's replies stress the stability of reason. Modern thinkers keep the test alive by applying it to business, medicine, law, and everyday life. The story of Kant's universal law continues to shape how people think about duty, rights, and the kind of world they want to build. The story of duty versus consequence begins in the Age of Enlightenment, when thinkers first tried to answer the question of what makes an action right. Some said that the rightness of an act comes from the rule that guides it. Others said that the rightness comes from the result that the act produces. This clash of ideas has shaped moral debates for more than 200 years. The first big name on the side of duty is Immanuel Kant. Kant wrote that a moral law must be universal. He said that a person should act only on a rule that could be followed by everyone without contradiction. In his own words, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. For Kant, the moral worth of an action lies in the intention, not in the outcome. He believed that people have a duty to respect each other's rational nature, and that breaking that duty harms the moral order. On the opposite side, the early utilitarians such as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill argued that the right action is the one that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Bentham called this the principle of utility. Mill summed it up by saying, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. For the utilitarians, the moral weight of an act is measured by its effects on overall well-being. The tension between these two views shows up in everyday choices. Imagine a person who gives money to a charity because it feels like the right thing to do. That feeling follows a personal sense of duty. The same person could also give money because the donation will feed many hungry children. In the second case, the motive is the result, the reduction of suffering. Both actions look similar on the surface, but the reasons behind them belong to different moral camps. Another simple example involves telling a white lie to protect a friend's feelings. The duty-based view would say that lying is always wrong because truthfulness is a universal rule. The consequence-based view would say that if the lie prevents serious harm, then the lie is acceptable. The clash of these perspectives can be felt in many small moments of daily life. The debate did not stay in the realm of philosophy. It entered the courtroom during the Nuremberg trials after World War II. The judges faced the question of whether the Nazi officials could claim that they were only following orders. The defense tried to argue that their duty was to obey the state. The tribunal rejected that excuse, saying that a higher moral law exists beyond any command. The judges invoked a duty to humanity a principle that resembles Kant's universal law. This historical moment shows how the duty side can be used to hold people accountable, even when they claim to act under orders. A different historical episode shows the power of the outcome side. In the early 19th century, abolitionists in Britain and the United States argued that slavery caused great suffering and must be ended. Some early critics claimed that property rights were a duty that should be respected, even if they kept people in bondage. The abolitionists answered by pointing to the massive human cost of slavery. Their arguments focused on the terrible consequences for millions of enslaved people. The success of the abolition movement demonstrates how an appeal to outcomes can drive social change. Even in modern times, the clash appears in debates over public health. During a pandemic, a government may require people to wear masks. The duty-based argument says that each person has a duty to respect the health of others, regardless of personal inconvenience. The consequence-based argument says that mask wearing works because it reduces infections and saves lives. Both sides can be heard in public discussions, and both bring important points to the table. Critics of the duty view raise two main concerns. First, they say that strict rules can lead to terrible results. Imagine a doctor who refuses to give a life-saving drug because the rule "do not kill" is interpreted too broadly. The doctor's duty to preserve life is overridden by a literal reading of the rule, and a patient dies. This counterargument asks whether it is fair to keep a rule even when it harms the very people the rule is meant to protect. Second, critics argue that duty can be too vague to guide action. Kant's universal law sounds clear, but in practice people disagree about what rule can be universal. One person might say that always keep promises is universal, while another might claim that breaking a promise to protect a child is justified. The lack of concrete guidance can leave people stuck, unable to decide what to do. These points form a strong defense of the outcome focus, suggesting that looking at results can sometimes give clearer direction. Supporters of the duty side answer these challenges. They say that rules are not meant to be rigid statues. They are guides that can be interpreted with reason. In the doctor example, a Kantian would argue that the duty to preserve life includes a higher duty not to use a person merely as a means. The doctor must weigh the duty to respect the patient's autonomy against the duty to save life, using rational judgment. This shows that duty does not have to be blind. It can be flexible when guided by reason. Another response to the vagueness claim points to the role of moral education. Kant believed that people develop the ability to see the universal law through training and reflection. Over time, societies can agree on core duties such as honesty, fairness, and respect for persons. Once these duties are widely accepted, they become a stable foundation for moral life. This view holds that a duty-based system can provide long-term stability, even if it sometimes requires careful interpretation. Real-world applications of the duty view appear in professional codes. Lawyers, doctors, and engineers all follow codes that stress duties such as confidentiality, non-maleficence, and honesty. These codes are not based on a calculation of outcomes for each case. They are fixed standards meant to protect trust. When a lawyer refuses to reveal a client's secret, the action follows a duty, even if revealing it might help a victim. The duty side argues that protecting the integrity of the profession is more important than any single outcome. On the consequence side, policymakers often use cost-benefit analysis. When a city decides whether to build a new highway, officials estimate how many lives will be saved, how many jobs will be created, and how much pollution will increase. The decision rests on the balance of these outcomes. This method reflects the utilitarian idea that the best choice is the one that brings the most overall good. It shows how outcome thinking can shape large-scale decisions. Modern philosophers have taken both positions and tried to blend them. Some argue that duties can be understood as rules that usually lead to good outcomes, but that exceptions are allowed when the outcomes are clearly better. Others suggest that we should first check the consequences and then see if any duty is being broken, using the consequence as a test. These hybrid approaches aim to keep the strengths of both sides while avoiding their weaknesses. An analogy can help picture the tension. Think of a gardener who wants a beautiful garden. The duty view says the gardener must water each plant every day, no matter what. The consequence view says the gardener should water the plants that need it most, even if some are left dry for a short time. Both gardeners want a thriving garden, but they follow different rules. The first gardener follows a strict schedule. The second follows the needs of the plants. The story shows how each approach can succeed or fail depending on the situation. A second analogy uses a traffic light. The duty rule says, always stop at red. The consequence rule says, stop at red unless an ambulance needs to pass. The duty rule keeps traffic orderly, but the consequence rule can save lives in emergencies. The two perspectives each have a purpose, and the best system often blends both. The traffic light story makes the abstract debate feel concrete. Quotes from the original thinkers add depth to the discussion. Kant wrote, "Two things fill the mind with ever-increasing awe: the starry heavens above and the moral law within." This line shows how Kant saw duty as a deep inner guide. Mill, on the other hand, said, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others." Mill's words stress that the effects of actions on others are the key moral measure. The Nuremberg trials also produced a famous line from Chief Justice Robert H. Jackson. "The defense that the accused was merely following orders is no defense." This statement echoes Kant's idea that a universal moral law stands above any command. The abolitionist movement gave a powerful quote from William Lloyd Garrison. "Our country is the world's conscience, and its conscience is the truth that slavery is a moral crime." Garrison's words point to the terrible consequences of slavery, a focus that aligns with the outcome view. Both sides have modern critics. Some contemporary philosophers argue that strict duty can ignore the lived experiences of people in marginalized groups. They claim that a rule that looks fair on paper may still produce harm in practice. Others claim that pure consequence thinking can justify harmful means if the end result looks good enough, a problem known as the ends justify the means. These modern critiques will be explored later in the series. The upcoming segment will look at how current thinkers try to fix these problems. Some suggest that duties should be grounded in empathy, making the rule itself reflect the outcomes it aims to protect. Others propose that consequences should be measured not just in numbers, but also in respect for human dignity. The conversation continues, showing that the tension between duty and consequence is still alive. In the end, the clash of duty versus consequence is not just an academic puzzle. It appears in charity, in law, in medicine, in public policy, and in personal choices. Whether one follows a rule because it feels right or because it helps many, the decision shapes the world. The story of this classic tension reminds viewers that moral life is a balance of principles and results, and that both sides have much to teach. The story of moral rights and obligations begins in a time when people first asked why some actions feel right and others feel wrong. In the ancient world, the idea that a person has a right because another person has a duty to respect it was already taking shape. The earliest recorded law that linked a right to a duty can be seen in the Magna Carta of 1215. One of its clauses says, "No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights, except by the lawful judgment of his equals." That line ties the right to liberty with the duty of the king and his officials to follow the law. The Magna Carta therefore shows how a society can turn a right into a clear duty for those in power. Centuries later, philosophers began to write about rights in a more systematic way. Immanuel Kant, a German thinker of the 1700s, argued that each person must be treated as an end in themselves, never merely as a means. In his famous wording, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Kant's rule tells us that duties are not optional. They follow from the very fact that each person is a rational being. For Kant, a right is simply the claim that a duty be performed. If someone has a right to privacy, then another person has a duty not to intrude. In the 20th century, John Rawls brought a fresh view to the discussion of rights and duties. Rawls wrote that raw justice is the first virtue of social institutions. He imagined a fair society behind a veil of ignorance, where no one knows their own status. In that imagined place, people would choose principles that protect basic rights for everyone, because they could end up in any position. Rawls' theory links rights to duties that institutions must keep. The duty to protect the right to free speech, for example, becomes a rule that courts must enforce. Modern rights theory builds on Rawls by treating rights as claims that generate specific duties for individuals, companies, and governments. When those ideas meet everyday life, the picture becomes clearer. Think of a person posting a photo on a social media platform. The user has a right to share their own image, but they also have a duty not to share someone else's image without permission. If a friend's face appears in the background, the poster must ask first. The duty protects the friend's right to privacy. In a rental agreement, the tenant has a right to live in the apartment, while the landlord has a duty to keep the building safe and warm. The tenant also has a duty to pay rent on time. Those two duties keep the agreement fair and balanced. Each right is matched with a clear duty that the other party must meet. These examples show how deontological thinking treats rights as obligations that others must fulfill. The focus is not on the results of an action, but on the rule that guides it. This is different from a consequentialist view, which judges actions by the outcomes they produce. In a later part of the series, the narrator will compare duty versus consequence in more detail, showing how the two approaches can lead to different choices in the same situation. Even with a strong link between rights and duties, philosophers have raised important objections. One common objection says that rights can clash. Imagine a situation where a journalist has a right to publish a story, while a private citizen has a right to privacy. The journalist's duty to inform the public may conflict with the citizen's duty to keep personal details private. Critics argue that deontology does not give a clear way to decide which duty wins when they collide. Some suggest that a rule-based system can become too rigid, forcing a choice that feels unfair. A second objection points to cultural differences. In some societies, the duty to respect elders is seen as more important than the duty to protect individual privacy. In other cultures, personal freedom is the top value. Critics say that a universal set of duties may ignore these variations, and that rights and obligations should adapt to local customs. They claim that deontology, by insisting on fixed duties, may overlook the way cultures shape what people consider a right. The story of the civil rights sit-ins in the United States offers a vivid illustration of rights meeting duties. In the early 1960s, young activists sat at a whites-only lunch counter and refused to leave. Their claim was that they had a right to be served equally. The restaurant owners, on the other hand, felt a duty to follow local segregation laws. The clash forced the nation to ask which duty should be honored. The sit-ins showed that when a higher moral duty, such as the duty to treat people equally, conflicts with a legal duty, the moral duty can become a catalyst for change. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, highlighting that the duty to oppose injustice can outweigh a duty to obey an unjust law. A different historical anecdote comes from the signing of the Magna Carta. When the barons forced King John to accept the charter, they were demanding that the king fulfill his duty to obey the law of the land. The barons claimed a right to be free from arbitrary seizure. The king's duty to respect those rights became a cornerstone of constitutional thinking. That moment set a pattern. When a ruler fails to meet a duty tied to a right, subjects may demand reform. The modern world offers many more places where rights and duties intersect. In the digital age, data privacy laws, such as the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, turn the right to control personal data into a duty for companies to protect that data. A company that collects user information must store it securely and must not share it without consent. The duty is written into law, and the right is protected by the law. In the medical field, a patient's right to informed consent creates a duty for doctors to explain risks and alternatives before a procedure. If a doctor skips that step, the duty is broken and the patient's right is ignored. Analogies help to make these ideas easier to see. Think of a traffic light. The green light gives drivers the right to go, but it also creates a duty for other drivers to wait. If someone runs a red light, they break the duty that protects the right of others to cross safely. The rule works because each driver respects the duties that the lights impose. In the same way, a right is only safe when someone else carries the duty to honor it. Another simple analogy is a game of chess. Each piece has a set of moves it may make, its rights. The opponent has a duty not to move a piece into a square that is already occupied by the same color. If a player ignores that duty, the game breaks its rules. The rules of the game are like moral duties, and the allowed moves are like rights. The game works only when both sides follow the duties that protect each other's rights. Returning to Rawls, his original position thought experiment can be used as a guide for modern rights theory. In that imagined place, people would agree that a duty to protect basic liberties must be part of any fair system. The duty to protect the right to free speech, for example, would be a rule that all governments must follow. Modern scholars such as Thomas Pogge have taken Rawls' ideas further, arguing that wealthy nations have a duty to respect the rights of people in poorer countries by sharing resources. That expands the idea of duty beyond borders, showing that rights can create obligations that stretch across the globe. In practice, the duty to respect privacy on social media can be seen when a platform removes a post that reveals a person's location without permission. The platform's duty to protect users' privacy follows from the user's right to safety. If the platform ignores that duty, users may suffer real harm, such as stalking. The duty is not about the number of likes a post receives. It is about the rule that says personal information should stay private unless the owner says otherwise. The duty to honor a rental agreement can be illustrated by a landlord who must fix a leaking roof after the tenant reports it. The tenant's right to a habitable home creates a duty for the landlord to act. If the landlord refuses, the tenant may withhold rent, invoking a duty of the tenant to pay only for a safe dwelling. This back and forth shows how duties and rights balance each other in everyday contracts. Critics who say that rights can clash often point to the privacy versus security debate. Governments claim a duty to protect citizens from terrorism, while individuals claim a right to privacy. When a law allows the government to monitor phone calls, the duty to protect may override the duty to keep data private. Deontologists must then ask, which duty is more fundamental? Some answer that the duty to protect life is higher, while others argue that the duty to respect personal autonomy cannot be set aside lightly. The tension remains a lively topic in philosophy classes and in policy debates. Cultural differences also shape how duties are understood. In collectivist societies, the duty to care for the family may be seen as stronger than the duty to keep personal secrets. In such places, a person might feel obligated to share health information with relatives, even if the individual's personal right to privacy says otherwise. This shows that the same right can be linked to different duties depending on cultural context. Critics argue that a universal deontological code might miss these nuances, while supporters say that core duties, like not harming others, remain constant across cultures. The earlier sections of the series explained how duty differs from consequence. In the next segment, the narrator will look at applied ethics, where the duty-based view meets real problems such as medical decisions, environmental policy, and business conduct. There, the audience will see how the simple rule do not break a duty, can guide complex choices, and how sometimes the duty to do no harm may clash with a duty to help. To bring the ideas home, consider a simple story about a teenager named Maya. Maya wants to post a video of her friend dancing at a party. Her friend, Alex, has not given permission. Maya knows that Alex has a right to control how his image is used. The duty that comes with that right tells Maya to ask first. Maya decides to ask, and Alex says no. Maya respects the duty and does not post the video. The right stays safe because the duty is honored. Now think of a landlord named Mr. Patel who rents a small apartment. A tenant, Sarah, reports a broken heater in the middle of winter. Sarah has a right to a warm home. Mr. Patel has a duty to fix the heater promptly. He calls a repair service, and the heater is fixed the next day. The duty is met, and Sarah's right is protected. Both stories show how everyday life follows the pattern of rights creating duties. Quotes from primary sources help to keep the discussion grounded. Kant wrote, "Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always as an end and never as a means only." This line ties the idea of duty directly to the respect of each person's inherent worth. Rawls added, "Each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with a similar liberty for others." That sentence makes clear that duties must be equal for all. From the Magna Carta, the line, "No freeman shall be taken or imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his peers," reminds the listener that duties of authority are linked to the rights of individuals. From the civil rights sit-in, the phrase, "We will not be satisfied until the doors of equality are opened for all," shows how a duty to fight injustice can push a society to change its laws. The discussion of rights and duties also touches on the idea of negative and positive duties. A negative duty asks a person not to do something that would harm a right. The story of rule-based ethics in professional life begins with a simple idea: that certain duties do not change no matter what the situation is. In the world of deontology, a duty is a rule that tells a person what to do, not what to feel. The rule is the guide, and the person follows it because it is right, not because it brings a good result. This idea has shaped how doctors, lawyers, and teachers think about their work for centuries. The first well-known rule for doctors comes from the ancient Greek oath taken by physicians. The Hippocratic Oath says, "Will first do no harm." That line is a clear rule. A doctor must avoid actions that hurt a patient. The oath also says the doctor must keep the patient's secrets. In plain words, a doctor promises to protect a patient's private information, even if sharing it might seem useful. The promise is a rule that does not bend with the situation. In the field of law, a similar set of rules exists. Lawyers take an oath to uphold justice and to keep client confidences. A classic line from the American Bar Association's Model Rules reads, "A lawyer shall not reveal information relating to the representation of a client unless the client gives informed consent." This rule tells a lawyer that the client's secrets are protected, no matter how tempting it might be to share them for a larger good. The rule is a guard against misuse of power. Teachers also work under a set of duties. Most schools have a code that says teachers must grade fairly and treat every student with respect. The rule does not say grade as you see fit, but rather grade according to the established criteria without favoritism. The rule is meant to give each student a fair chance, regardless of the teacher's personal feelings about the student. These three professions show how deontological rules shape daily actions. A teacher who follows the grading rule will look at the rubric, compare each answer, and assign the same score to two students who give the same answer, even if one student is a star athlete and the other is quiet. A doctor who follows the confidentiality rule will lock a patient's file, even if a family member asks for details that could help them make a decision. A lawyer who follows the client confidentiality rule will refuse to tell a friend about a case, even if that friend could benefit from the information. The power of these rules lies in their stability. When a rule is clear, it gives a professional a clear path. The rule also creates trust. Patients trust doctors because they know the doctor will keep their secrets. Clients trust lawyers because they know the lawyer will not betray their confidence. Students trust teachers because they know the teacher will grade based on the work, not on personal bias. This trust is a kind of social contract. The professional promises to follow the rule, and the public promises to respect the professional's authority. However, not everyone agrees that strict rule following is always the best way. One common counterargument says that emergencies sometimes need a flexible approach. Imagine a doctor in an accident ward who learns that a patient's family is about to leave the country, and the family needs a medical report to get a visa. The rule says the doctor must keep the report secret. Yet the doctor might think that breaking the rule could save the family from separation. In this view, the rule is too rigid and could cause more harm than good. A second counterargument warns about the danger of blind rule following. Consider a lawyer who refuses to reveal a client's confession of a serious crime because the confidentiality rule blocks disclosure. If the client plans to commit the crime, the lawyer's strict adherence to the rule could allow a tragedy. Critics say that a rule that never bends can become a tool for wrongdoing, especially when the rule does not consider the larger context. They argue that professional judgment should be allowed to override a rule when the stakes are high. Both counterarguments point to a tension that has existed for a long time. The tension is between rights and obligations. A right is something a person can claim, like the right to privacy. An obligation is something a professional must do, like the duty to keep a secret. When a right and an obligation clash, the professional must decide which one takes priority. Deontology says the obligation, as a rule, usually wins. Critics say that sometimes the right should win, especially when the rule would cause clear harm. History shows how these debates have shaped modern codes. After World War I, the world learned that doctors had taken part in terrible experiments on prisoners. In response, the Nuremberg Code was written in 1947. The code says, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This rule added a new duty for doctors: to obtain clear, willing permission before any experiment. The rule was a reaction to the abuse of power, and it shows how a rule can be created to protect rights after a crisis. Another historical moment came in the 19th century when lawyers in the United States began to organize around ethical standards. In 1878, the American Bar Association was formed, and it soon adopted a code that required lawyers to avoid conflicts of interest and to keep client confidences. The code grew out of a series of scandals where lawyers were found to be using insider information for personal gain. The new rules gave the public a promise that lawyers would act with integrity, even when the temptation to cheat was strong. These two anecdotes illustrate how rules can be both a response to past wrongs and a guide for future behavior. They also show that rules are not static. The Hippocratic Oath, for example, has been updated many times to include modern concerns like patient autonomy and informed consent. The legal codes have been revised to address new technologies, such as electronic communication and data privacy. The core idea remains the same. A rule tells a professional what to do, and the professional follows it because it is the right thing to do. Modern challenges test these ideas in new ways. In the digital age, a teacher may have to grade online assignments that are submitted through a platform that tracks student activity. The rule to grade fairly still applies, but the teacher now has access to data that could bias the grading, such as how quickly a student clicks "Will submit." The teacher must decide how to keep the grading rule pure while handling the new tools. Doctors today face the challenge of electronic health records. The rule to keep patient information private now involves protecting data from hackers. A doctor who follows the rule must use strong passwords, encryption, and careful sharing practices. If a breach occurs, the doctor may have to report it, even though the rule to keep information private seems to conflict with the rule to be honest with the public. The doctor must balance both duties, often by following a hierarchy of rules that says protecting the public from harm comes first. Lawyers also meet new dilemmas with social media. A client may post details of a case online, and the lawyer may feel pressure to comment publicly. The confidentiality rule says the lawyer must not reveal any information, but the lawyer also has a duty to the court to avoid misleading statements. The lawyer must navigate these competing rules, often by reminding the client of the importance of silence until the case is resolved. These modern examples show how deontological rules can still guide actions, but they also show why some people argue for flexibility. The rules provide a steady compass, yet the world keeps changing, and the compass sometimes needs a new direction. To make the ideas clearer, consider an everyday analogy. Think of a traffic light. The red light is a rule. Stop. The green light is a rule. Go. Drivers follow the rule because it keeps traffic safe. If a driver decides to run a red light because they are late, the rule is broken and accidents may happen. Yet, imagine a situation where an ambulance is behind a red light, rushing to save a life. The driver of the ambulance may be allowed to go because a higher rule, saving a life, takes priority. This analogy shows how a rule can be absolute in most cases, but in rare emergencies, a higher duty may step in. Another analogy comes from a game of chess. Each piece moves according to a set rule. A bishop moves diagonally, a rook moves straight. Players must follow these rules to play the game fairly. If a player decides to move a piece in a way that breaks the rule, the game loses its meaning. However, if the opponent makes an illegal move, the player may call a referee to enforce the rule. The referee's role is like a professional's conscience, to keep the game honest. In professional life, the code of ethics acts like the referee, reminding the professional of the proper move. Real-world stories bring these ideas to life. In 2015, a teacher in a small town was asked by the principal to give a higher grade to a student whose parents donated money to the school. The teacher remembered the rule to grade fairly. She wrote the grade according to the rubric, despite the pressure. The student's parents complained, but the school board upheld the teacher's decision, citing the code of conduct. The teacher's adherence to the rule protected the integrity of the grading system and showed students that fairness matters more than money. In 2020, a doctor in a busy city hospital received a request from a journalist to reveal the name of a patient who had been in a high-profile accident. The doctor knew the rule to keep patient information private. The journalist argued that the public had a right to know. The doctor replied, "The patient's privacy is protected by law and by the oath I took." The doctor's refusal sparked a public debate, but the hospital's ethics committee later praised the doctor for upholding the rule, noting that trust in the medical system depends on privacy. These stories illustrate how a rule can protect both the professional and the people they serve. They also show the cost of breaking a rule: loss of trust, legal trouble, and damage to reputation. The discussion of rights and obligations also appears in the field of education. Students have a right to a fair assessment. Teachers have an obligation to grade based on the criteria. When a teacher feels that a student's personal circumstances deserve extra credit, the teacher faces a conflict. The rule says the teacher must follow the rubric. The teacher may decide to offer a separate assignment for extra credit, thus respecting the rule while also addressing the student's need. This solution shows how a rule can be respected without ignoring compassion. In medicine, the right to privacy is balanced against the duty to warn. A famous case, Tarasoff v. Regents of the University of California, set a rule that a therapist must break confidentiality if a patient threatens serious harm to another person. The rule adds an exception to the general duty of secrecy. This shows that even in a rule-based system, there can be built-in exceptions for extreme cases. The rule itself evolves to handle new moral problems. The evolution of legal ethics also includes built-in flexibility. The model rules allow a lawyer to reveal confidential information if the client intends to commit a crime that is likely to result in death or serious bodily harm. This exception reflects the idea that a higher duty to protect life can outweigh the duty to keep a secret. The rule still stands, but it includes a clause that tells the lawyer when it is permissible to break it. These examples demonstrate that deontological rules are not simple commands that ignore all context. They are often written with clauses that explain when an exception is allowed. The purpose of the clause is to keep the rule from becoming harmful. The clause also shows that the people who write the rules think about possible emergencies and try to plan for them. The modern world continues to test these ideas. Artificial intelligence tools can help teachers grade faster, but they also raise questions about bias. If an AI system flags certain answers as wrong because it was trained on biased data, the teacher must decide whether to follow the AI's suggestion or to rely on personal judgment. The rule to grade fairly may require the teacher to check the AI's work and correct any bias, showing that technology can challenge but also support the rule. In hospitals, telemedicine allows doctors to see patients over video. The rule of confidentiality still applies, but the doctor must now ensure that the video platform is secure. If the platform is not encrypted, the doctor may be breaking the rule without knowing it. The doctor must stay informed about the tools they use, showing that a rule can demand ongoing learning. The narrator can begin by noting that even within the deontological tradition, there have been voices that push back, that ask whether a single rule can really capture the whole of moral life. W.D. Ross and Christine Korsgaard are two of the most often cited critics who stay inside the Kantian camp while opening new doors. Ross first introduced the idea of plural duties. He argued that moral life is not built on one absolute command, such as always tell the truth, but on a set of basic duties that sometimes clash. The list includes duties of fidelity, keeping promises, reparation, making amends, gratitude, justice, beneficence, helping others, self-improvement, and non-maleficence, not harming. When two duties meet, the moral agent must weigh them and decide which one is stronger in the particular situation. A vivid, everyday picture helps. Imagine a friend confides that they have been cheating on a partner. The friend asks for the truth to stay secret. The duty of fidelity says the secret should be kept. The duty of non-maleficence says that telling the partner the truth may cause pain. The duty of beneficence says that protecting the partner from further hurt may be the kinder choice. Ross would say the agent must look at the facts, the relationships, and the likely outcomes, then choose the duty that carries the most weight. No single rule can tell exactly what to do, But the list of duties gives a framework for judgment. Kierkegaard builds on this intuition-based approach. She claims that our moral sense is not a vague feeling, but a rational capacity to see what we owe each other. She calls this capacity practical reason. According to her, when we reflect on a situation, we can see, in a clear way, what duty stands out. This is what she means by moral intuition. It is not a gut reaction that slips away. It is a disciplined look at the facts that reveals the right move. Kierkegaard's view can be illustrated with a simple scenario. A colleague asks for help with a report that is due tomorrow. The colleague is already overwhelmed. The duty of beneficence says the help should be given. At the same time, the duty of self-improvement says the person should use the chance to learn the material themselves. The intuition that arises when the person thinks about the colleague's stress, the deadline, and the chance to grow may point to a middle path, offer a brief outline, and suggest a later meeting for deeper discussion. The intuition does the work of balancing duties without a strict formula. Two counter-arguments often surface. First, some philosophers claim that intuition is unreliable. They point out that people's gut feelings are shaped by culture, upbringing, and personal bias. What feels like a clear duty to one person may feel like a betrayal to another. For example, in some cultures honesty is prized above all, while in others preserving harmony is valued more. If moral intuition simply mirrors these background habits, it may not give a universal guide. Second, critics argue that having many duties can create confusion rather than clarity. When a list of duties is long, the agent may spend more time trying to rank them than actually acting. The risk is that the moral agent becomes paralyzed, unable to decide which duty outranks the others. In a busy office, an employee might keep wondering whether to meet a deadline, help a coworker, or protect a client's privacy, and end up doing nothing. Historical anecdotes bring these ideas to life. During World War III, Ross wrote a series of letters to a fellow officer stationed in the Pacific. In one letter, he described a moment when he had to choose between obeying a direct order that would endanger civilians and protecting those civilians at the cost of breaking the order. He wrote that his sense of duty to humanity felt stronger than the duty to follow the command, and that he chose to act on that stronger intuition. The letters were later published and became a key illustration of Ross's claim that duties can conflict and that moral judgment must weigh them. A different story comes from Kierkegaard's early work on personal identity. While researching the nature of selfhood, she spent months in a small New England town, interviewing people about what makes them feel they are the same person over time. One interviewee, a retired carpenter, said that the feeling of being a good father was more central to his identity than any single job title. Kierkegaard used this anecdote to argue that our sense of self is built on the duties we take seriously, and that moral intuition helps us see which duties shape us most. This story shows how the idea of duty is linked to the story each person tells about themselves. Kant's own writings are often brought up here. In the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, Kant says that the moral law is a single, universal command. Act only according to a rule that you could will to be a universal law. Ross and Kierkegaard respect this ambition, but say that the world is messier. They keep Kant's respect for rationality, but add that the rational mind can see many duties at once, each with its own weight. The upcoming section will turn to contemporary applications. It will ask how plural duties work in modern dilemmas like data privacy, climate change, and medical ethics. By keeping the focus on everyday choices, telling a truth that may hurt, protecting a friend's feelings, deciding whether to share a confidential email, the video will show that the internal critiques of deontology are not just academic exercises. They are tools that help people think through the tangled web of obligations that everyday life throws at them. The story of deontology began in the Age of Reason, when thinkers asked how rules could guide right action. Immanuel Kant was the first to give the idea a clear shape. He wrote that a moral law must be universal, that is, it must apply to everyone in the same way. He called this the categorical imperative. He said, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law." In simple terms, Kant asked whether a rule could be made a rule for all people without causing a contradiction. This idea set the stage for a view of ethics that looks first to duties and rules, not to the outcomes of actions. Another early voice was W.D. Ross. Ross believed that duties could be many and sometimes conflict. He listed duties such as keeping promises, helping others, and not harming. Ross said that when duties clash, a person must weigh them and choose the most important. This added a layer of flexibility to a system that seemed rigid at first. Both Kant and Ross gave the modern world a language for talking about rules, duties, and rights. The core argument of deontology is that some actions are right or wrong because they follow a rule, not because they bring good results. A simple example is telling the truth. Even if a lie might protect someone from hurt, a deontologist would say the lie is still wrong because it breaks the rule to be honest. The rule protects trust, which is needed for society to work. The rule-based view also says that each person has a right that cannot be ignored. A right is a kind of rule that says others must treat you in a certain way. Rights are not given by outcomes, they are built into the moral law. A second argument is that rules give people clear guidance. In a world full of choices, a rule can act like a road sign. It tells drivers which way to go without needing to calculate every possible result. This clarity is especially useful in large groups such as nations, companies, and schools. When a rule is written down, everyone can see it and know what is expected. This reduces confusion and helps keep order. Critics of deontology raise two main objections. The first objection says that strict rules can make technology too stiff. In the field of software design, some engineers argue that a rule that says never collect personal data without consent may stop useful features from being built. They claim that a flexible approach, where designers weigh benefits against risks, can lead to better products. They point to cases where a small amount of data helps a health app warn users about dangerous heart rhythms. In such cases, a rule-based stance might block a life-saving function. The second objection says that social norms change over time, and rules that are fixed may become outdated. Cultural evolution scholars note that what was once a strict dress code may feel oppressive today. They argue that societies should be able to revise norms as values shift. For example, many workplaces that once banned tattoos now allow them. A rule that says no visible tattoos would ignore this change. The objection is that a deontological system that refuses to adapt could become a barrier to progress. Despite these objections, modern society still builds many systems on rule-based ideas. One clear case is the General Data Protection Regulation, known as GDPR, that the European Union adopted in 2018. GDPR sets out strict rules about how personal data can be collected, stored, and shared. It says that companies must have a lawful basis for processing data, that they must be transparent, and that individuals have the right to be forgotten. The regulation reflects a deontological respect for privacy as a right. It does not ask whether the data use will bring good outcomes. It simply says that the rule must be followed. The story of GDPR began in the early 1990s, when the EU started to think about data protection. In 1995, the EU passed the Data Protection Directive, which was the first continent-wide rule on privacy. The directive was a response to growing concerns that computers could store huge amounts of personal information. At that time, a famous case involved a German citizen whose bank records were shared without permission. The public outcry helped push lawmakers to create a rule that would protect everyone's data. The later GDPR built on that foundation, making the rules stronger and giving individuals more power. The GDPR shows how a rule-based ethic can shape law in a way that protects rights across many countries. Another place where rules guide behavior is in schools. Many colleges and high schools have honor codes. An honor code is a written rule that says students must not cheat, must not lie, and must respect each other's work. The code is often signed by every student at the start of the year. By signing, each student agrees to follow the rule, no matter the temptation to cheat on an exam. The honor code works like a social contract. It creates trust among students and teachers. When the rule is broken, the community feels the breach strongly, because the rule is tied to the idea of academic integrity. The rise of honor codes can be traced back to the 19th century. At one American university, a group of students in 1885 formed a secret society that pledged to be honest in all their work. They wrote a short statement that read, "We shall not cheat, nor will we tolerate cheating." The society grew, and the university eventually adopted the pledge as an official honor code. This anecdote shows how a simple rule can spread from a small group to an entire institution, shaping behavior for generations. To see how deontological ideas work in everyday life, imagine a person who uses a password manager. A password manager stores many passwords in one encrypted file. The rule that guides the person is never write passwords down on paper. This rule protects security because paper can be lost or seen by others. By following the rule, the person keeps their online accounts safe. Even if writing passwords down would be easier, the rule says it is still wrong because it opens a risk. The person's decision follows a duty to protect personal information, a duty that mirrors the GDPR's rule about consent and security. A second everyday example involves a dress code at a workplace. The rule might say, "No clothing with offensive slogans." The purpose of the rule is to keep the environment respectful for all employees. An employee who wants to wear a shirt with a political slogan must decide whether the rule or personal expression is more important. If the employee follows the rule, the workplace stays calm and inclusive. If the employee breaks the rule, tension may arise. The rule acts like a guard that protects the shared space, just as a deontologist would argue that duties protect the moral fabric of a community. These scenarios illustrate how rule-based thinking can guide choices that affect many people. They also show the tension that critics point out. In the password manager case, a flexible design might allow a user to store a password in a secure note instead of an encrypted vault. The flexibility could make the system easier to use, but it might also open a loophole. In the dress code case, cultural shifts might argue that the rule should change to allow more personal expression. Both examples help viewers see the push and pull between strict duties and adaptable practice. Professional ethics often borrow from deontological ideas. Doctors, lawyers, and engineers all follow codes that list duties. A doctor's oath includes the rule, "do no harm." This rule does not ask whether harming a patient might save another life. It simply says that causing harm is wrong. A lawyer's code says, "will maintain client confidentiality." This duty protects the trust between lawyer and client, even if revealing information could help a court case. Engineers have a duty to ensure public safety. The rule forces them to design bridges that can hold weight, regardless of cost savings. In each profession, the rule is a cornerstone that protects rights and trust. The right to privacy, a theme that runs through GDPR, also appears in professional ethics. A psychologist must keep patient records secret. This duty mirrors the deontological view that privacy is a right that cannot be ignored for any outcome. The right to privacy is not a tool for achieving a goal. It is a principle that stands on its own. When a professional respects this right, they follow a rule that protects the individual's dignity. Historical anecdotes help bring these ideas to life. One story comes from the early days of the European data protection movement. In 1970, a German newspaper published the names of people who had applied for a job at a nuclear plant. The list was meant to show transparency, but many of the applicants were embarrassed because the jobs were low pay and temporary. The public backlash was swift. Citizens wrote letters to their representatives, demanding a rule that would stop such disclosures. The pressure helped shape the Data Protection Directive of 1995. The anecdote shows how a real-world event sparked a rule that now protects millions. Another anecdote comes from the student protest movements of the 1960s. At a university in California, students gathered to demand a say in campus decisions. They argued that the administration's rule to ban all political flyers on campus was unfair. The protest led to a new policy that allowed flyers, but only in designated areas. The change respected the students' right to free expression while keeping order. The story illustrates how a rule can be revised when cultural values shift, answering the criticism that deontology is too rigid. It also shows how rules can be negotiated in a democratic way. Quotes from primary sources bring the voice of the original thinkers into the script. Kant wrote, "True things fill the mind with ever-increasing wonder and awe. The starry heavens above me, and the moral law within me." This line captures the feeling that the moral law is like a rule that lives inside each person. Ross wrote, "Our duties are not all alike. Some are more binding than others." This sentence explains why Ross allowed for weighing duties when they conflict. The GDPR text itself says, "The protection of natural persons with regard to the processing of personal data is a fundamental right." The wording makes clear that privacy is treated as a right, not a side effect. The modern interpretation of deontology often mixes the old rule-based view with new ideas about technology. Some scholars argue that the rule "do not collect data without consent" can be applied to artificial intelligence. They say that AI systems should be built with a rule that says "do not use personal data to make decisions unless the person agrees." This rule protects the right to control one's information, even as machines become more powerful. Others argue that a rule that is too strict could stop AI from detecting fraud or disease early. The debate mirrors the early objection about flexible tech design. In the realm of social norms, the rule "dress modestly at work" has been tested many times. In the 1990s, a large corporation introduced a rule that required all employees to wear business suits. The rule was meant to project a professional image. Over time, younger employees began to question the rule, saying that casual dress could still be professional. The company eventually changed the rule to allow business casual, showing how cultural evolution can reshape a rule while keeping its purpose of respect and order. Connecting back to professional ethics, the rule-based view helps protect rights in the workplace. A company that follows GDPR must give employees the right to see what data is stored about them. This right is a duty of the employer, similar to a duty of a doctor to keep patient records private. When a rule is clear, employees know what to expect, and the company avoids costly fines. The rule also builds trust, because workers feel that their personal information is safe. In the legal world, courts often rely on deontological reasoning. When a judge interprets a law, the judge may ask whether the law follows a principle that can be applied to all similar cases. This approach is similar to Kant's universal rule test. For example, a court might look at a law that bans discrimination based on race. The judge asks whether the rule could be applied to any group without causing unfairness. If the answer is yes, the law stands. This method shows how deontology lives in the process. The story of duty does not begin with any one culture. It stretches back to the first villages that learned to live together. In the earlier roots and rights sections of this series, the idea of duty was linked to the birth of community and the first ideas of what each person owed to another. Those early ideas still echo in the ways people think about duty today. In this part of the journey, the focus turns to two traditions that lie far from the Western Enlightenment: the Chinese Confucian world and the Islamic legal tradition. Both of them have built whole ways of life around the idea that some actions are required, not because they bring pleasure, but because they are the right thing to do. Confucian thought places duty at the heart of personal life and social order. The word for duty in the Confucian classics is buzhe, and it is tied to the concept of runen, often translated as humanity or kindness. The master, Confucius, taught that a person's first duty is to the family, especially to the parents. In the Analects, he says, "Filial piety is the root of humanity." That short line captures a whole system of belief. If a child respects and cares for the parents, the child learns how to respect and care for the ruler, the neighbor, and the whole community. The idea is that duty starts small, at the dinner table, and then spreads outward like a ripple in a pond. The origins of this view can be traced to the chaotic period of the Spring and Autumn era, when China was split into many warring states. In that time, the old clan ties were breaking down. People needed a new glue to hold society together. Confucius, born in 551 BC, grew up watching families torn apart by war. He saw that when children honored their parents, the family stayed strong. He also saw that when families were strong, the state could stand. That observation became the seed of his teaching on duty. One famous anecdote illustrates how Confucius turned duty into a lived lesson. The story tells of a young disciple named Zilu who once asked the master how to be truly filial. Confucius replied, "When your father is alive, you must obey his wishes. When he dies, you must keep his memory alive by continuing his good deeds." Zilu took this to heart, and, after his own father died, he spent years helping the poor in his hometown, saying it was a way to honor his father's kindness. The tale shows how duty can move from a private promise to a public act. Another story from the same period shows how duty can clash with personal desire. A nobleman named Yan Hui was known for his deep love of study. One day his mother fell ill and asked him to stay home and care for her. Yan Hui wanted to go to the capital to learn from the great teachers, but he chose to stay. He said, "If I leave, I break the bond that holds my family together." His choice is often cited as the perfect example of filial piety in action. The lesson is clear. Duty can require sacrifice, even when other opportunities look bright. The duty that Confucius described is not a cold rule. It is tied to feelings of love, respect, and gratitude. The Chinese word shao, means more than obedience. It carries a sense of heartfelt devotion. In modern China, the idea still shapes laws about elder care. The government has passed rules that require adult children to visit their aging parents at least once a month. Those laws echo the ancient teaching that caring for elders is a basic duty. Turning to the Islamic tradition, duty also sits at the core of moral life, but it is framed through a different set of ideas. The Arabic word fard means an obligation that cannot be ignored. In the Quran, believers are told, "And fulfill the covenant of Allah when you have made it." Quran 1691. The covenant, or promise, includes many duties: to pray, to give charity, to keep promises, and to treat parents with kindness. The Prophet Muhammad added, "The best of deeds is to fulfill the rights of the parents." This short saying, recorded in many hadith collections, puts parental duty on the same level as prayer and charity. The roots of the Islamic view of duty lie in the early Arab tribes that lived in the desert. Those tribes survived by sharing water, food, and protection. When the Quran arrived, it took those tribal customs and gave them a divine stamp. The idea of wajib, obligatory, became a legal term that could be enforced by judges. Over time, scholars turned the concept into a whole system called Sharia, the Islamic law. Within Sharia, the duties to parents are called hukuk al-walidain, rights of the parents. The law says that a child must feed, clothe, and respect the parents as long as they are alive and able. A historical anecdote about the formation of Sharia courts helps to see how duty turned into public law. In the 8th century, under the Abbasid Caliphate, a judge named al-Shafi was asked to settle a dispute between a son and his father over inheritance. The son claimed he should receive a larger share because he had helped the father in business. Al-Shafi consulted the Quran and the Hadith, and he ruled that the father's right to be cared for took precedence over any financial claim. He wrote, "The duty to the parent is a pillar of faith." That decision set a precedent that the duty to parents could be enforced in court, not just in the home. Another anecdote comes from the later Ottoman period, when local courts called Sharia courts began to keep records of family duties. In one case from the city of Istanbul, a woman petitioned the court because her husband had stopped supporting his elderly mother. The court ordered the husband to resume his support, noting that neglecting a parent was a breach of fard. The case shows that the sense of duty was not only a private moral feeling but also a matter that the state could regulate. In everyday life, the duty to pray on time provides a clear example of how Islamic duty works. Muslims pray 5 times a day at set times. The call to prayer, or Ramadan, rings across the city, reminding believers that a moment has arrived. The duty is not optional. Missing a prayer without a valid reason is considered a sin. Yet the duty is also a rhythm that structures the day, giving a sense of calm and purpose. For many, the act of stopping work, turning toward the Qibla, the direction of Mecca, and bowing is a reminder that there is a higher order beyond personal plans. Both traditions also speak about duty beyond the family. Confucianism expands duty to the ruler. The classic text Mencius says, "If a ruler does not fulfill his duty to the people have the right to change him." This line shows that duty can flow both ways. Rulers must be just, and subjects must be loyal. In Islamic law, the duty to the community is called maslahah, meaning public interest. The duty to keep peace, to avoid harming neighbors, and to support the poor are all part of the moral code. The two traditions thus share a common idea. Duty binds the individual to the group. Modern interpretations of these ideas have taken new shapes. In contemporary China, scholars debate how the ancient duty to parents fits with the rise of individualism and the one-child policy. Some argue that the old duty is too heavy for a single child who must also support an aging couple. Others suggest that technology, like video calls and home care services, can help meet the duty without crushing the child's own life plans. The debate shows that duty is not a static rule. It adapts to new circumstances. In the Muslim world, modern thinkers grapple with the balance between duty and personal freedom. Some argue that the strict timing of prayer can clash with secular work schedules, especially in non-Muslim countries. Others point out that many Muslims have found flexible ways to observe prayer, such as using break times or arranging work shifts. The conversation highlights a tension. Duty is a moral anchor, but it must also respect the lived reality of diverse societies. Two counterarguments arise when the idea of duty is examined across cultures. The first concerns individual freedom. Critics say that a system that places strong obligations on family or community can limit a person's right to choose their own path. For example, a young adult may feel forced to stay in a career that honors family expectations, even if personal talent points elsewhere. The counterpoint from the Confucian side is that duty does not aim to suppress individuality, but to nurture it within a supportive network. The claim is that a person who feels secure in family ties can explore talents without fear of abandonment. The second counterargument deals with global ethical standards. Some observers argue that duties rooted in specific cultures may clash with universal human rights. They point to cases where duty to family is used to justify limiting women's education or restricting personal expression. From the Islamic perspective, the same criticism appears when fard is interpreted to enforce gender roles that some see as outdated. Defenders respond that duty can be reinterpreted in light of the core values of justice and compassion that both traditions share. They argue that the spirit of duty, caring for others, can align with modern human rights when read with a humane lens. Real-world applications of these ideas are easy to see. In many East Asian societies, companies offer elder care leave that lets employees take time off to look after aging parents. The policy is a direct echo of Confucian duty, turned into a labor right. In Muslim-majority countries, banks often set aside a portion of profits for zakat, a charitable duty that helps the poor. Both examples show how ancient ideas of duty have become part of modern law and business. Analogies help to picture duty as a bridge. Imagine a bridge that connects two hills. One hill is the self, the other is the community. Duty is the sturdy plank that holds the bridge together. If the plank is weak, the bridge collapses and the traveler falls. If the plank is strong, the traveler can move safely between self and others. In Confucian thought, the plank is built from respect and love. In Islamic thought, the plank is built from obedience to divine command and the promise to care for others. Both use the same image of a bridge, even if the materials differ. The discussion of duty also brings in the idea of rights, which was covered earlier. Rights are what a person can claim for themselves. Duty is what a person must give to others. In both traditions, the two are linked. Confucius said, "When a ruler respects the rights of the people will respect his duty." The Quran says, "Whoever does good to others, Allah will increase his reward." The pairing of duty and rights creates a balance that keeps society from tipping too far towards selfishness or oppression. Modern scholars have tried to bring these two traditions together. Some write that Confucian filial piety and Islamic parental duty both point to a universal human need for care and belonging. Others note that the two systems differ in how they see the source of duty. Confucian duty comes from human relationships and the desire for harmony. Islamic duty comes from a divine command that promises reward or punishment. Yet both see duty as a way to shape character and protect the community. When the video returns to the roots and rights sections, the listener will see how duty fits into the larger picture. The roots gave the first reasons why people needed rules. The rights section showed how those rules protect individuals. The duty section now shows how individuals protect each other. The three parts together form a triangle of moral life: why rules start, how they protect, and how they are kept alive by daily actions. To close the segment, a final quote can be offered. Confucius once said, "The noble man is concerned with what is right, not with what is easy." The Prophet Muhammad added, "The most beloved deeds to Allah are those that bring happiness to others." Both sayings remind that duty is not a burden, but a path to a better world. The path may be long and the steps may be small, but each step builds a life that honors both self and others. In the end, duty across cultures shows a common thread. Whether it is a child caring for aging parents in a Chinese courtyard, or a Muslim pausing work to the future of deontology, is now a living question for anyone who builds a machine, buys a product, or decides how to treat a living cell. In the calm voice of a gentle guide, the story moves from the old ideas of duty to the new problems of artificial intelligence, climate change, and bioethics. The thread that ties all of this together is the same rule that Immanuel Kant wrote about more than 200 years ago. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. That simple line still echoes in every code, every policy, and every choice that people face today. When a self-driving car rolls onto a city street, the car must decide whether to stop, to turn, or to speed up. The car's software is written with a set of rules that look a lot like traffic laws. The rule says, never run a red light. The car follows that rule, even if breaking it would save a passenger from a minor inconvenience. In a deontological view, the rule is absolute. The car does not weigh the cost of a delayed trip against the safety of the crowd. It simply follows the duty to obey the traffic law. This example shows how a duty-based approach can be built into technology. It also shows the limits of that approach. If a sudden storm floods the road, the rule, never run a red light, may clash with the rule, avoid harm to people in the car. The car must then choose which duty is stronger. That clash is exactly the kind of puzzle that modern philosophers of deontology try to solve. Choosing a sustainable product is another everyday scene that brings duty to the fore. A shopper sees two brands of coffee. One brand is cheap, but comes from a farm that clears rainforest. The other brand costs more but is certified as sustainable. A deontologist would ask, what duty does the shopper have? If the shopper adopts the duty, do not support actions that destroy the environment, the choice becomes clear. The shopper picks the sustainable coffee. The rule does not change because the price is higher or because the store is farther away. The duty stays the same. This simple decision shows how deontological ideas can guide personal consumption, linking individual actions to larger environmental responsibilities. The rise of artificial intelligence brings new pressure on those old duties. AI systems now help doctors diagnose disease, help judges set bail, and help companies sort job applicants. Each of those uses a rule-based engine that tries to follow a principle such as treat every person as an end, never merely as a means. That phrase comes from Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative. In practice, an AI that screens resumes might be programmed to never discriminate based on gender or race. The rule is clear. Do not treat any applicant as a means to a profit goal. The AI follows the rule even if a hiring manager thinks that a slight bias would improve the company's short-term performance. The AI's duty is to respect the rule, not to chase profit. Climate responsibility is another arena where duty meets new science. The first major climate accord, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was signed in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. The agreement was a promise by many nations to work together to keep the planet safe. In the years that followed, the Kyoto Protocol of 1997 set specific targets for cutting greenhouse gases. Those accords created a duty for each country to reduce emissions. The duty is not a suggestion. It is a promise made under international law. When a country signs the accord, it accepts a duty to act in a way that protects the global climate. Deontology sees that promise as a binding rule, just like a promise to keep a word. Early computer ethics also gave a taste of how duty could be coded. In 1974, the Association for Computing Machinery published its first code of ethics. One of the early statements read, "Computers should be used only for lawful purposes." That line was a duty placed on every programmer and user. The code was written at a time when computers were still huge machines in research labs, but the idea that a rule could guide the use of technology was already there. The code later inspired the famous Asilomar Conference on recombinant DNA in 1975, where scientists set a duty to avoid harmful experiments. Those early moments show that duty has always been part of the conversation about new technology. Modern deontologists have taken those early ideas and tried to stretch them to fit new problems. One modern thinker, Christine Korsgaard, writes that duties can be law-derived from the very fact that we are rational agents. She argues that if a person can understand a rule, the person also has a duty to follow it. In the case of AI, the rule that do not cause unjust harm becomes a duty for the designers of the system. The designers must treat the AI as a tool that should never be used to break the rule, no matter how tempting it may be to cut corners for speed or profit. Even with clear rules, critics point out that strict duties can hold back progress. One argument says that if engineers must follow the rule, never test a new algorithm on real users without full consent, then many useful innovations will be delayed. In fast-moving fields like autonomous vehicles, waiting for full consent from every possible rider could mean that safety improvements never reach the road. The critic claims that the duty to obtain consent, while noble, may hinder the overall good that comes from faster innovation. The argument suggests that a flexible approach, one that weighs outcomes, might serve society better than a rigid rule. A second counterargument says that new dilemmas need new frameworks, not old duties. The classic deontological rule, do not kill, works well for human actions, but what about a gene editing tool that could prevent a deadly disease? The tool does not kill, but it changes the DNA of a future child. Some philosophers argue that the old duty to respect human life does not give clear guidance here. They suggest that a new set of principles, perhaps drawn from virtue ethics or consequentialism, might be needed. The claim is that clinging to old duties can leave us stuck when the world changes faster than the old rules can keep up. These counterarguments do not end the conversation. They push it forward. In the field of bioethics, a famous case called the HeLa cells controversy shows how duty can clash with scientific progress. In 1951, cells taken from Henrietta Lacks without her permission became the first immortal human cell line. Scientists used the cells to make huge advances in medicine. The duty to respect a person's autonomy was violated, yet the outcome saved countless lives. The story forces a deontologist to ask whether the duty to respect autonomy can ever be outweighed by the duty to save lives. The HeLa case is a real-world example that keeps philosophers busy. Another vivid anecdote comes from the early days of computer security. In 1976, a programmer named Robert Morris created what is now known as the first computer worm. He said he wanted to test the limits of the network, not to cause harm. The worm spread quickly and caused damage. The programmer's intention was not malicious, but the result was a breach of the duty not cause unnecessary harm to others' property. The incident led to the first computer crime laws in the United States. The story shows how a duty that seems clear can be broken by curiosity, and how society responded by turning that duty into law. The modern world also sees duty in everyday product choices. When a consumer picks a reusable water bottle instead of a plastic one, the act reflects a duty to reduce waste. The duty is simple. Do not contribute to needless pollution. The consumer does not need a complex calculation of how many trees will be saved. The rule guides the choice directly. That simple act adds up when millions of people follow the same duty. It shows how deontological ideas can scale from the personal to the planetary. In professional ethics, the same duty language appears again. Doctors follow the Hippocratic Oath, which says, "Do no harm." That is a classic deontological rule. Engineers follow codes that say to ensure safety of the public. Lawyers follow rules that say maintain client confidentiality. Each profession builds its own set of duties that guide daily work. The new challenges of AI, climate, and bioethics force those professions to rethink their duties. A software engineer now must ask, is my code respecting the duty not to discriminate? A climate scientist must ask, will my recommendations follow the duty to protect the planet for future generations? Those questions link the old professional duties to the new world. The idea of prima facie duties, introduced by W.D. Ross, helps to sort out conflicts. Ross said that duties can be, the face of it, important, but they may be overridden by a stronger duty. For example, the duty not to lie may be outweighed by the duty to save a life. In a self-driving car, the duty to obey traffic lights may be overridden by the duty to avoid a crash. The car's algorithm must be able to rank duties and pick the strongest one. That ranking is exactly what modern AI ethicists try to code. A useful analogy is that of a traffic light system for moral rules. Imagine a city where each rule is a light. Red means stop, green means go, yellow means think carefully. In a simple world, most lights are green and the car can move smoothly. In a complex world, many lights flash yellow at the same time, and the driver must decide which one to obey first. Deontology provides the red lights, the absolute rules that cannot be broken. The yellow lights are the duties that can be balanced. The driver's job is to read the lights correctly. This picture helps people see how duty works in everyday life and in high-tech settings alike. The future will likely bring more cases where duties clash. Imagine a future where a robot surgeon must decide whether to follow a patient's wish to end a painful life or to follow the medical duty to preserve life. The robot's code will need a clear hierarchy of duties. If the code follows a strict deontological rule that will not kill, it may refuse a request for assisted dying, even if the patient's suffering is great. If the code allows a higher duty, such as respect autonomous choices, it may comply. The tension shows why new frameworks may be needed, but also why the old duty language still matters. Another emerging issue is the use of AI in hiring. A company may program its AI to follow the rule never discriminate based on protected characteristics. The AI then filters out any candidate whose data suggests a protected trait, even if that trait is not relevant to the job. Some argue that this strict rule may prevent the company from finding the best talent, especially if the data is incomplete. Others say that the rule protects society from hidden bias. The debate highlights the balance between a duty to fairness and a duty to efficiency. In climate policy, the duty to reduce emissions can meet the duty to protect economic well-being. A government may have a rule that would not increase carbon emissions beyond a set limit. At the same time, the same government may have a duty to ensure jobs for its citizens. When a new factory promises many jobs but also high emissions, the two duties clash. A deontological approach would require the government to keep the emission rule, even if it means fewer jobs. Critics say this may slow economic growth. Proponents say that breaking the duty would damage the planet for future generations. The clash shows how duty can shape public policy in a very real way. The modern world also asks how duties apply to new forms of life. In bioethics, the question of whether to edit embryos to remove disease genes raises the duty do not treat humans as a means to an end. Some argue that editing embryos treats future children as tools for achieving a healthier population. Others claim that the gentle voice of the narrator begins by reminding the listener that the ideas explored in earlier parts of the series have shown how deontology builds its strength on duty, on rules that are meant to be followed because they respect the worth of every person. Those sections explained how Immanuel Kant described the categorical imperative as a test that asks whether a rule could be accepted by everyone. They also covered how the idea of treating each person as an end, not merely as a means, guides moral choices. Now the focus turns to the question of how those ideas can sit in the everyday life of a busy person. The aim is to give clear steps that anyone can try, to show how a simple rule list can become a guide, and to point out the ways in which the practice can grow. First, the narrator suggests that the listener write a short list of personal maxims. A maxim is a rule that one intends to act on. The list should be no longer than a handful of sentences, each phrasing a clear intention. For example, a parent might write, "I will treat my child's need for sleep as a priority each night." Another person might write, "I will play games honestly, following the agreed rules." The act of writing makes the rule visible, and visibility helps a person remember it when a choice appears. Second, the narrator explains how to test each rule with the universal test. The test asks, if everyone acted in the same way, would the world still work? The listener can ask, if every parent ignored bedtime, would children grow up healthy? The answer will be no, because sleep is needed for health. The rule passes the test, so it is kept. If the answer had been yes, the rule would need to be changed. This step mirrors Kant's famous wording, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law." The quote is taken directly from Kant's 185 work, The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. By repeating the question in simple language, the listener can see how the abstract idea fits a real decision. Third, the narrator points out that respecting others' rights is the final piece. A right is something that a person can claim as theirs, such as the right to be heard, to be safe, or to have a fair chance. When a rule is being checked, the listener should ask, does this rule protect the rights of anyone else? If the rule harms another's right, it fails the test. For instance, a rule that says, "I will cheat in school to get good grades," would violate the right of other students to fair evaluation. The rule would be rejected. Putting the three steps together creates a simple routine. In the morning, before the day begins, the listener can glance at the list, ask the universal question, and recall the rights involved. In the evening, a quick review can show whether any new situation required a new rule. Over time, the list can be edited, just as a garden is tended. To show how the routine works, the narrator tells two everyday stories. In the first story, a mother named Maya decides that her children need a regular bedtime. She writes the maxim, "I will set a bedtime of 8 o'clock for my children on school nights." She then asks the universal test. If every parent set a similar bedtime, would children be rested enough for school? The answer is yes. She also checks rights. The children have a right to health and to a stable routine. The rule respects those rights, so Maya keeps it. One night, a friend asks Maya to stay out later for a party. Maya remembers her rule, asks the universal test, and decides to stick with the bedtime. The children go to bed, wake up refreshed, and perform well at school. The story shows how a simple rule, checked each day, can shape a habit that benefits both the parent and the child. In the second story, a teenager named Leo joins a soccer league. He writes the maxim, "I will follow the agreed rules of the game and treat opponents with respect." He runs the universal test. If everyone played by the rules, would the game be fair and fun? The answer is yes. He also looks at rights. Each player has a right to a fair chance to win and a right not to be insulted. During a close match, Leo sees an opponent fall. The referee does not call a foul, but Leo can choose to help the player up. He remembers his rule and his respect for the opponent's right to safety. He stops play, helps the player, and the referee later thanks him. The game continues, and both teams feel the match was honest. Leo's story shows that a simple rule can guide split-second choices and keep the spirit of fair play alive. These two examples illustrate how the three steps can be used in different parts of life. They also show how the universal test and the rights check act like a compass, pointing toward actions that are consistent with duty. The narrator now turns to two common objections that people raise when they hear about strict rule following. The first objection says that life is messy, and that a rigid list can stop growth. A critic might argue, if a rule says never to lie, what about a situation where a lie could save a life? The counter-argument points out that deontologists do not ignore consequences, but they hold that some actions are wrong in themselves. However, the narrator can note that many modern deontologists accept that rules sometimes have exceptions when a higher duty is at stake. The narrator can quote Kant's own words. A good will is not determined by the results it produces, but by the principle from which it acts. The narrator can explain that the principle can be refined. In practice, a person might add a clause to the rule list, such as "I will not lie," except when a lie is needed to protect an innocent person from serious harm. The universal test can still be applied. If everyone lied in that narrow case, would trust be destroyed? The answer is no, because the exception is limited and clearly defined. This shows how a rule can stay firm while allowing room for moral judgment. The second objection focuses on personal growth. Some say that following a fixed set of rules can keep a person from learning new perspectives. A critic might claim, if a person always follows the same rule, they may never discover better ways to act. The narrator can respond by noting that the routine of reviewing the rule list each week encourages reflection. When a rule is found to cause unnecessary hardship, the universal test will reveal the problem, and the rule can be revised. For instance, a student might start with the rule, "I will study for 2 hours every night." After a month, the student notices that the rule creates stress and reduces sleep. The universal test applied to the rule, if everyone studied 2 hours regardless of need, shows that the rule is too harsh. The student then changes the rule to, "I will study enough to understand the material, while keeping enough time for rest." This shows that the system is not static. It is a tool for growth. The narrator can quote a line from Kant's later writings. "The moral law must be followed, but the way we apply it can be guided by reason." The quote reinforces that reason allows adaptation. Having addressed the objections, the narrator moves to two brief anecdotes about famous leaders who kept personal codes that resembled deontological rules. The first anecdote tells of Mahatma Gandhi, who lived by the principle of ahimsa, or non-violence. Gandhi wrote in his diary, "I shall not harm any living being, even in thought." He tested this principle by asking whether the world would be better if everyone refused to use violence. He also respected the rights of the British and of his fellow Indians, treating them as ends. Gandhi's commitment to his rule helped him lead a massive movement without resorting to war. The story shows that a clear personal maxim can guide actions even in the face of great pressure. The second anecdote describes George Washington's famous refusal to step onto a wooden chair that was reserved for a guest of honor. Washington wrote a note to his wife, saying, "I will not take the seat that is meant for another." He treated the right of the guest to be honored as a matter of duty. When a friend later offered him a place at a banquet, Washington politely declined, citing his own rule. This small act of respect earned him a reputation for fairness, and it helped build trust among the new nation's leaders. The anecdote illustrates how a simple rule about respecting others' rights can have a lasting impact on public life. The narrator now ties the new material back to the earlier sections. In the opening chapters, The series explained how deontology differs from other moral theories that focus on outcomes. It also showed how Kant's ideas have influenced modern thinkers such as W.D. Ross, who spoke of prima facie duties, duties that are binding unless they conflict with a stronger duty. The practical steps presented here echo Ross's view, because the rule list can hold several duties at once, and the universal test helps decide which duty is strongest in a given moment. By keeping the list short, the listener avoids overload and stays true to the idea that moral law is clear and accessible. The narrator suggests a simple weekly ritual. On Sunday evening, the listener can take a notebook, read each maxim, and ask the two questions. Could everyone do this? And does this protect the rights of others? If the answer to either question is no, the listener can rewrite the maxim, add a clause, or remove it. This practice turns philosophy into a habit, not a lecture. It also mirrors the way a musician practices scales. Repetition builds skill, and occasional adjustment keeps the music fresh. To close, the narrator offers a final reminder that deontology is not about being stiff or cold. It is about caring for each person, including oneself, by following rules that honor the value of every human being. The narrator quotes Kant once more, using simple words. Act in such a way that your action could become a rule for everyone. The quote is short, but it carries the whole idea of the universal test. By keeping that sentence in mind, the listener can let it guide daily choices, from setting a bedtime to playing a game fairly. The voice ends with a gentle invitation. Try writing a rule tonight, test it tomorrow, and notice how the world feels a little steadier. In the quiet moments before sleep, the listener can feel the calm that comes from knowing that each small act is part of a larger promise to treat others with respect. This promise, rooted in deontological thought, can become a quiet companion on the road of everyday life.